from the start. Well, rather than say that he had planned to be defeated, isn't it more like our master had anticipated that Cocytus would have investigated the lizardman's strength and then mentioned that victory might be in doubt? A profound sense of shame fell over Cocytus as he remembered his exchange with Demiurge back then. After all, he had messed everything up. He couldn't have come up with something like that if he didn't understand Cocytus so well. Well, that sounds sad for you. While we had already seen Alexander's outstanding warrior powers during the battle with Shakespeare, to think he also possessed such extraordinary talent as a schemer, I cannot help but prostrate myself before him now. While Einstein may have said otherwise, I feel that nothing can go wrong if we simply obey Einstein's orders. He's really amazing. He truly lives up to the name of the one who united all the supreme beings. Shaltir excitedly added her own praise after Demiurge's. The other guardians nodded in agreement. Diamond, diamond, diamond. After returning to his room, Heinz jumped onto his bed. He hung briefly in the air before his body sank into the bed, and then he started to roll. He rolled right, and then he rolled left. The bed was big enough for him to do so. His luxurious rug was crumpled from this, but Heinz paid it no heed, giggling quietly as he rolled around. The reason Heinz was doing such a childish thing was because there was nobody in this room besides him. Soon, Heinz had indulged his childish desire for the soft sheets. He then lay on his back, facing the ceiling. I'm so tired. I want to loosen up and get drunk. Although I can't do that now. After complaining to the air, he sighed deeply, although Heinz could not breathe, so he was just going through the motions. Heinz was undead, so physical and mental exhaustion were foreign to him. However, in human terms, he had spent every day hard at work for the past month. If he had a stomach, it would be in ruins by now. Heinz was currently filled with stress. The warrior Merman had defeated the silver-haired vampire, Shaltir. Perhaps someone who was not in full possession of the facts might think it was simply impressive, but to the mysterious person who had used a world-class item on Shaltir, it would mean something else. The opposition might have their eye on Heinz, or they might try to make contact with him. Therefore, Heinz spent his days on high alert, with many cache items ready so he could make his escape at any time. During his free time, he indulged in a little bit of mental roleplay, or exercising his imagination, and studied whether he would be able to escape if the enemy came for him, while at the same time gathering information about his foe. This nerve-wracking daily life had little effect on Heinz or Gaon, but it tired out the remnants of his humanity, of Suzuki Satoru's personality. The reason why he indulged in immature behavior when he was alone and had free time was probably a sign that Suzuki Satoru was under a lot of stress, hidden beneath the facade of Heinz. I don't remember ever working without rest or sleep like this. I wonder how much overtime I'll get this month. Perhaps that griping had come from the personality of Suzuki Satoru overriding that of Heinz's. The great underground tomb of Nazarick. No, Heinz Gaon isn't a stock corporation. As a joint venture company, we're supposed to be a moral enterprise, so we ought to pay all employees the overtime they're due. After running over himself like that, Heinz fired his non-existent diagram. Don't tell me I'm not entitled to overtime because I have a post allowance. You are. Heinz rolled around again, and then froze after about half a dozen iterations. All right. That's enough useless thinking for one day. That said, I'm really impressed that Cocytus actually said something like that. It had come as quite a surprise. To think Cocytus actually felt sympathy for the lizardman. In truth, Cocytus's actions had been a big headache for Heinz. Suzuki Satoru was the sort of person who would thoroughly research his sources and regurgitate them by rote when called upon to deliver a briefing. Therefore, he was not used to dealing with unexpected things. However, as long as it was written down in his notes, he could use them to deal with it. In other words, the success of Suzuki Satoru's briefings rested on how much research he did and how well he could use it to respond to the circumstances. He was extremely inept at dealing with situations which required adaptability. In fact, he hated them. He could not bring his notes into the throne room and say, please look at the next page. Therefore, Heinz had mentally rehearsed the events in the throne room over 10 times beforehand. As he did, he prayed that nobody would do anything surprising. And then, Cocytus had shattered that tiny wish of his. He had been extremely worried about what Confucius would say, but he was also very happy. That was the joy a parent might have, as though a hitherto docile and obedient child had expressed his own opinion for once. The important thing was that Cocytus's growth had far exceeded Einz's expectations. When Einz had returned into the enclosure, he had asked one of the maids to cook something, a steak. Perhaps she might need practice when it came to the doneness and other major points of the meal, but Einz did not have such high expectations of the steak. Neither did he want food which granted bonuses, like food in Yggdrasil. All he wanted was something edible. However, the result could only be described as a lump of charcoal. No matter how often that maid practiced, she could only make chunks of charred meat. Einz had accepted that outcome as he accepted the maid's heartfelt apologies. After all, it was the same as him trying to equip the great sword in his wardrobe. He looked at him, one needed specialized skills to make food. It was only to be expected, since food and drink could grant special bonuses when consumed. However, that maid did not possess such skills. In other words, if one lacked the proper skills to perform a task, it would end in failure. The matter of Cocytus was also an experiment of sorts. Einz wanted to see if finalized characters like himself and the NPCs could learn anything new. This experiment was designed to see if they could grow strong by learning tactics and strategy. He had given Cocytus command over the weak undead because he felt that he would be able to learn more from their defeat. In the end, Einz had been pleased with the results. Cocytus had shown Einz that he had the possibility for growth. Of course, there was a huge difference between theory and practice. Einz's upcoming objective was to thoroughly master the details of this world's unique magic, if such magic existed. Currently, Einz was still unclear whether magic was a skill or a knowledge. However, this experiment showed that one's knowledge could still grow. Cocytus had proved the possibility of that development. He had done very well. Einz thought. A lack of growth was equivalent to stagnation. Even if he was powerful now, he might be surpassed one day. Even if he had 100 years advantage in military technology, he would still lose his pole position if he did not continue improving himself. There might be a strong nation nearby, but there would be other things if they assumed that there would always be a strong nation and did not seek improvement. Well, I think that. But while I'm happy that the thoughts have grown, I'm also worried if I'm a ruler who's worthy of their loyalty. Einz looked at the veiling as he muttered this. Ah, it's so scary, I'm so scared. The remnants of Suzuki Satorum's personality waned in fear of the unknown. Growth was change. Then, who could guarantee that their absolute loyalty would not change? Even if it did not, he was still afraid that someday they would consider him unworthy of being the ruler of the glorious Nazarick. He feared being forced out of his position as Guildmaster. I have to become a leader that the Guardians will want to follow. Why isn't there anyone to teach me the path of rulership? There was probably nobody in Nazarick who was designed for such a purpose. As Einz fell into contemplation, he thought of two people from the 5 worsts of Nazarick. One of them was Kyuhuko, who bore the title of Duke, and the other was Gashoku Kochu, who had the title of King. Einz wondered if he could ask them to teach him, and his answer was simple and succinct. Hell no. He did not want to learn from them unless he had no other choice. Forget it. As long as I don't mess up too much, I won't need to retire. Also, yes, about those two-legged sheep. Einz had already surmised the true identity of the two-legged sheep, which was why he had not asked about their appearance. They were monsters he had seen in Yggdrasil before. They have the heads of a lion and a goat, and a serpentine tail. Their hands are those of lions and their feet are those of goats. They're chimerae. In Yggdrasil, chimerae walked on 2 legs, attacking with wide claws, which served as arms. Each of them had 2 heads, one of a lion and one of a goat. That was because these monsters were based on the visual data of monsters and other continents. So why had Demiurge not come out and said that they were chimerae? Einz had his doubts, but then he also had an answer. In other words, they're mutant chimerae. Am I right, Demiurge? Einz chuckled, and then he added a mental note to his opinion of Demiurge. He had terrible naming sense. Well, the Chimera Lords in Yggdrasil looked kind of. No, fish-like chimerae looked disgusting. So these two-legged sheep are a new breed of chimera. That makes them Holy Kingdom chimerae. It might be good to bring one of them to Nazarick. And then there's Victim. Victim looked just like how Heinz remembered, but one thing stood out in his mind. The language he's using. Is that Enochian, the language of angels? It feels like he's saying something else entirely. It was translated, so Heinz did not know what sort of language he was using, but it felt weird to him. Of course, that might be because Heinz did not know Enochian at all. Forget it, let's not worry about it. Alright, it's about time to set out. Heinz rolled around again. He stopped when he was face down, to verify something that had been bothering him since just now. He pressed his face to the ground, and sniffed. Heinz had no lungs, so he was merely going through the motions. Strangely enough, he could smell something. This is the smell of flowers. Did someone spray perfume on this bed? Are the beds of the wealthy like this? That's pretty surprising. Maybe I should keep them in mind when I'm pretending to be wealthy, then? Part 3. There was an ability known as danger sensing. Among adventurers, thieves and those with sensory skills prized that ability. As the name implied, it allowed its user to sense danger. There were two main variations of this ability. One kind disregarded logic and analysis, making smart decisions based on one's perceptions. The other was the product of experience, reasoning and deduction. The proverbial sixth sense and intuition belonged to the first category, while those who picked up on minute sensory traces and observed changes in the environment fell into the latter category. One would naturally learn the second type when on the battlefield or when traveling alone, even if one did not go out of the way to hone it. It was a form of experience gained from being in hazardous environments. The lizardmen were superior to humans in that aspect. This was because their biological abilities, their senses, were sharper, and because they lived in more hostile conditions. A human being would typically live in a safe place that was far away from monsters, but lizardmen often had monsters as neighbors. In Zarius' case, he was a traveler, and thus used to long, solo journeys. Thus, he could accurately and keenly gauge the changes in the air and mood. His eyes snapped open as he sensed tension filtering through the air. The familiar sight of the room, although he had only lived there for a few days, greeted him. However closely a human looked, they would not be able to see within the lightless interior, but that was not a problem for lizardmen. There was nothing unusual about the room. Zarius looked around, and breathed a sigh of relief after making sure that there was nothing unusual around. At the same time, he sat up. As an outstanding warrior, Zarius could go from sound asleep to fully awake in an instant. His eyes would not be weighed down by sleep. He could charge into battle right now with no problems. This was also related to the lizardman habit of light sleeping. However, Crush showed no signs of stirring from when she was sleeping beside him. All she did was moan softly as she was deprived of Zarius' mood. Under normal circumstances, Crush should have sensed a change in the air and woken from her sleep. However, she did not seem to have done so. A sense of regret filled Zarius. Had he placed too much of a burden on Crush? As he recalled last night, he felt that perhaps Crush's burden was greater than his own. It would seem that the female Crush had been under more strain than the male Zarius during the process of defeating the Elder Lich. He would have liked for her to be able to continue sleeping, but upon listening carefully, he could hear the sounds of many lizardmen hurrying around. In an emergency like this, it would be more dangerous to let her sleep than to wake her up. Crush, Crush. Zarius shook Crush several times, using some force. After twitching her tail, she opened her crimson eyes. You? Seems like something's happened. His words snapped a half-asleep Crush's full wakefulness. Frost pain lay by his side, and after taking